It is a very good afternoon. Oh, whatever time of the day you happen to be listening to this, it is Niall boiling. And I decided I'd come back to something that we come back to on a regular basis, which is COVID-19. COVID-19, it's, for me, nearly got me fired back in between 2020 and 2023 because of not my opinions on it, because I kind of wasn't really allowed to have an opinion because I worked in media and obviously we have to be impartial. But the very fact that I even questioned it, or the very fact that I even allowed two sides of the story on, or the very fact that I allowed some people to come on and suggest that lockdowns weren't the right solution, I was threatened with my job on numerous occasions, not by my own employers, can I point out, but by other people, also by the government as well, who refused to come on the show. And at the time as well, you know, I was put down on a government paper as being a broadcaster that was anti-lockdown and anti-government policy, which wasn't the case, by the way. I questioned lockdown, I questioned government policy, and I questioned all of those things. And it now turns out that I was on the right side of history, it seems, because there are many people now who are questioning the lessons that we've learned from COVID-19 and how we managed it. And not just how we managed it, but the COVID-19 vaccine is also coming under scrutiny as well. And there are many people who say they've been damaged by the vaccine. Now, I'm not suggesting everybody was damaged by the vaccine, but we need to start taking these things seriously. We weren't up to now. There were many doctors at the time who come onto my show, and they would say to my producer before they would come on, tell him not to ask me this, tell him not to ask me that, because I can't answer it honestly. Because if I do, I'll lose my job. And that was the case with many professors, many doctors who came on my show at that particular time. And we all saw what happened to Marcus de Bruin, for example, who only recently was outside the Irish Medical Council fighting for his career, which has been put forward now till July. We've also seen what happened to Martin Feely. Sadly, he passed away. But again, he spoke out because he believed we were grossly exaggerating the mortality rates of COVID-19. He even went on prime time. Actually, I think they just brought him on prime time to try and make a fool of him. But they brought him on prime time and then forced him to resign. He was a qualified doctor, but he was forced to resign because he had an opinion which wasn't in agreement with the opinion in effort. Well, now it seems that doctors, professors, and many others are coming out and saying, well, hold on a minute. These were right. There were many people out there who had valid opinions and they were suppressed. And Mark Zuckerberg himself said he has suppressed the opinions of many people because he was told to do so by the White House at the time. And he said he regrets that. It's a bit late saying that now. The very idea that you would even suggest at the time that the virus didn't actually come from a wet market, it might have come from a lab in Wuhan, would have got you suspended from Twitter or Facebook. Now it turns out the White House has put out an official statement saying that's most likely true. So who do we believe anymore? Were we all conned? No, certainly not. There was a virus called COVID-19. But was it as dangerous as we all thought it was? Remember those days when Leo Varadkar stood on the steps in Washington and told us lots of us are going to die? It was like the bubonic plague or TB all over again. But that didn't happen. None of that happened. Those videos that went viral around January, just before COVID-19, and those videos that we all got on WhatsApp of people stepping over people in Wuhan and China that had died on the streets, it never happened. It was all some sort of propaganda. I don't know what it was, but it never actually happened. There weren't people dying on the streets. And the huge question mark for Marcus de Bruin at the time, of course, was, why would you ask a child to take a vaccine for a virus, really, that was of no harm to them? Because no children died. One child died, I think, in Ireland, but they had numerous other complications. So why would you ask children to take a vaccine, which they could have automatic immunity to? The whole thing made very little sense. We all turned against each other. We all became curtain twitchers. Looking out the window, oh, there's Betty. Look, she's outside her 6 mile or 6K zone. I better report her. Or we had broadcasters, famous broadcasters on the air suggesting if you didn't get the vaccine, you were a murderer. You were going to kill your granny. All sorts of mad stuff. It now turned out, of course, that the vaccine was never tested for transmissibility or to stop transmissibility. We were told by professors who were on the radio constantly all the time, get this vaccine, 100%, you'll never get COVID-19. Actually, they do get COVID-19. Okay, you might get COVID-19, but you won't get as sick. Actually, they were just as sick. Okay, you might not just get sick, but you won't end up in hospital. Well, some of them did end up in hospital and in ICU and all those things. So was the vaccine a complete failure? So back to the management. Well, two men who've published a paper in the International Journal of Public Health, Dr. Gerry Quinn, Centre for Molecular Biosciences at Ulster University, and Dr. Ronan Connolly, Centre for Environmental Research in Neurosciences. And the paper they've published is called What Lessons Can Be Learned from the Management of the COVID-19 Pandemic? And the both of them join me now. Lads, hi. And welcome to the show. I'll start off with you first, Gerry. I mean, if I go right back to when COVID-19 kicked off first, for most of us, it was kind of 2020 March. I suppose there was genuine fear, wasn't there? Because did we know what we were dealing with? Or at that stage, did you have a fair idea that this is probably not as dangerous as people are saying it is?
Yeah, the answer is no, I didn't. I was privy to the same information that everybody else had, I saw the videos from China as well, and I kind of wondered what was what were they suffering from? They'd shake and then fall down in the street, and I was having difficulty wondering what kind of disease it was, and they told us it was related to the common cold. It was another SARS-CoV infection. So I didn't, and I believed what was coming out. But it just seemed a bit strange that. The only other disease that I knew that had those kind of symptoms was Wales disease, where you perish very rapidly and then you go into some kind of shake and then you die, And I was privy to the same news. It wasn't until they made statements about, what were they going to do, then I thought that doesn't seem logical, but, maybe they know something that I don't know,
Yeah. And at the time, and I know you're more the figures man, Ronan, the modelling in the United Kingdom by Mr. Ferguson was that 500,000 people were going to die. That was an outrageous figure. And why was this modelling that they did there and here? Because Leo Varadkar even mentioned that a lot of people would die. And when we look back at the statistics now and the figures now, we see that excess deaths were actually down for those 2 years. So why was the modelling so inaccurate?
Well, to get back, just from my personal thing, I actually already had COVID in March 2020 along with my parents. So I knew this was real. I survived. My parents, it was a little bit worse for them because they're obviously older, but we got through it before the lockdowns. And then I'm just in recovery. And then this is before March the 17th. Remember St. Patrick's Day? They shut it down. And I was like, wait, this doesn't really make sense. But in terms of the modeling, there was this I didn't really know it until we started investigating what are these models based on. But they all go back to, there was these two Scottish epidemiologists in 1927, Kermack and McKendrick. They developed this mathematical set of differential equations. I don't know if your viewers did calculus in.
Well, I remember that, yeah.
School, but that was it. So you had a set of equations that could be solved with pen and paper. And they were trying to see how could we describe a model. So it was quite a simple model. It gave some useful results. And so people said, hey, this is very useful in 1927. And then in the 60s and 70s, people started implementing it as a computer, started doing it with computers. And in the 2000s, Ferguson started saying, oh, we could use this. But there's lots of other groups were using the same framework model. And even, I don't know if your viewers might have heard of, there was a thing called the Great Barrington Declaration.
Yes, I'm right. I actually interviewed some of them on the radio at the time.
Okay, did you interview Professor Sunetra Gupta?
I did. And by the way, can I point out, I was probably one of the only ones to interview them in Irish media.
So she also had used the SEER model as well, the same one. But she put in a range of possible, because she knew at the time that there was there's a difference between I don't want to get too technical, but there's the case fatality rate and there's the infection fatality rate. So if you go back when the Chinese were saying everybody was dying, what they were saying is that, oh, here's the number of people that we've identified, and this is the percentage of them that died. But the people that they identified were the ones that were coming to hospital at death's door. And so they were more likely to die than the people who had like a sniffles or didn't even notice, what we then called asymptomatic. So most people, actually, it turned out in the end, most people, except for among the elderly or, say, severe obesity, are the ones that ended up on ventilators in hospitals or mistreatment. Most of them didn't actually die. We later found out that the actual fatality rate was a lot lower. So Professor Gupta back then was looking and saying, well, we don't know how many are undiagnosed. So when she submitted the same model, including a range, but her results were less scary.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, the UK's SAGE decided, we prefer...
We are like his are scarier. They're better, yeah. I mean, the other thing too, Gerry, was that at the time, in the early stages, Italy, of course, what happened in Italy was used, I suppose, to instill a huge amount of fear in people. Now, the Italians went about it the whole wrong way by saying, basically, anybody who comes in with COVID-19 was to be admitted to hospital. All of a sudden, the beds were full. And then, because they have an older population, many of the people who really needed those beds couldn't get them and couldn't get onto a ventilator and sadly passed away. So they just went about it the wrong way. It was like, obviously, there was a flu epidemic and they didn't treat the right people. They treated all the wrong people. Many of the people that were in the beds probably just didn't need to be there. They're just young people with a sniffle. So that was really where the real scare came from when people seen what happened in Italy, wasn't it?
Well, it came from China and it looked as if it was coming across to Italy. And, I was discussing with Ronan before we came on to the talk about, how the government come up with all their policies, because they all seem to be the same.
Yeah.
They all wanted to do lockdown. They all wanted to do this testing and all that stuff, but you kind of touched on the point that, because we had this thing about deaths with COVID and deaths of COVID, so you're kind of touching on the point of, did people die from mistreatment or did they die from COVID, and that's when we began to think, that there might be something a bit strange about the data that they're presenting, because all of the people that they said died from COVID, and in the UK's estimation, you could have a positive test and die 60 days later.
They'd hit by a bus. Yeah. But Leo Varadkar here in Ireland admitted that at the time, that many of the people that they had put down as deaths from COVID-19 actually weren't from COVID-19. They were from something else, but they had COVID-19 within the last 30 days, which means literally, as you rightly said, you could get COVID-19, you might even be asymptomatic, you might have no symptoms whatsoever and be run over by a bus 3 days later, and you went down as a COVID death, which was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. And that still happens to be the case. And many of those deaths that are related to COVID-19 are deaths with COVID-19 and from COVID-19. I was even actually, when I said that on the air, I was fact-checked by the Journal, which I was quite proud of, to be honest with you. But, I mean, that kind of gave us an indication too. Around, I suppose about 4 months in, when all the panic had stopped, the initial panic had stopped, Gerry, I imagine at that point, you being involved, and when I say you being, involved in the science end of it and yourself as well, Ronan, you would have saw, well, hold on, this is just not as bad as they're making it out to be. The mortality rate clearly is a lot lower than they claimed it was at the start. We now see the evidence that the majority of people who are dying are over the age of 70. So why are we locking down whole countries? Why are we demanding everybody wears these silly masks? Whatever about an N95 mask, but these masks that people are taking out of their back pockets and half putting on their face or whatever, which made absolutely no difference whatsoever. Why are we doing all this when really we should be spending and focusing all our time looking after the elderly who may have comorbidities and, would succumb to death if they got a bad respiratory virus? So why did nobody see that, apart from people like you, people like Ronan, people like me? Why did nobody see that, Gerry?
We were wondering that exact thing. And we tried to see who else was trying to, because this is the thing, we weren't getting published. Scientists that knew this, and the way a scientist tells the news is to publish an article, like a peer-reviewed paper. But there was very, very few peer-reviewed papers getting out. The first one I read was maybe Woods in 2021, who said that, no. He published in 2021. The information was from 2020. He tried to say that even though the government had initiated a lockdown, then the cases started to fall before the lockdown was initiated, So we were trying to, at that time, find information from other other scientists. No, I used to work in an HIV laboratory in Florida with other people that were investigating HIV and very pathogenic diseases. And obviously we took steps to avoid all of this. But when I looked at some of the measures that were taken in the UK, they made absolutely no infection control sense, absolutely no immunological sense. I mean, everyone would go to the supermarket. Everybody.
Mm-hmm.
They'd have a screen about the height of your head, and then everyone would pass their shopping through one end. The person on the other side of the till would handle everything for an 8-hour period of all of these people. That would be if there was a real infection or a real pandemic, that would be a focus for infection. But then nothing was said about it. Instead, they done this superficial measures that.
It was all aesthetics, wasn't it? Really?
They were theoretical. There was some person's pet theory, and they're like, "Oh, let's just try this." And half of them had never been tried before. There was no. Carol Hennigan said there was no evidence base for any of these measures.
But there's been published papers out since, not including your own, by the way, but there's been published papers out since that stated that, looking at all the lockdowns, all the measures, all the restrictions in many different countries around the world, including Ireland, which was to the extreme. We had the second longest lockdown in the world, with 2 countries who didn't have a lockdown at all or any restrictions. And they said that basically between masks and social distancing and lockdowns, it actually made little or no difference. In other words, those countries fared off equally just as well as the countries who had the serious restrictions. So that's kind of bizarre when we look back. But, but nobody's going to be accountable. I mean, this is a wonderful paper for people who want to read it, by the way. It's quite a big paper, okay, so you'll have to take a bit of time, pardon me, to go through it. But, I mean, it's really interesting. And just in relation to that, Gerry, the whole idea that it was carried on, Ronan. So the one question that gets me every single time, and I'll come back to some of the finer details of the paper in a second, but the one question that gets me all the time is, what was the purpose then? If, we're intelligent people, I would think, and I assume that, people in charge of government are intelligent, well, reasonably, and yet they still wanted to carry on with something that was destroying economies, destroying lives. They knew that lockdowns in themselves were going to cause deaths because people couldn't get to see a doctor, they get undiagnosed cancers, all of those things. But yet they continue to roll on like a steam train. Why do you think that happened, Ronan? Why was it for so long?
I think we could have you could do a whole interview just on that one question. And because it's so multifaceted. I'll say in the first few months, the models were a key bit, and people may forget, but do you remember, we had preprints. We managed to get a preprint published in August 2021. It took us years. We then started getting other, but we were sharing it with NEFIT, and you would get people. Some of the people in NEFIT were saying, "Oh, this is very, very good. We thank you for providing it." But then you would have others. So, you remember IMAG was in the Irish case, was they were... ISAG,
the Irish Scientists Against whatever it was they were against, yeah. ISAG.
Yeah, but there was this was the modelling group, was the main bit. And so these models, I don't want to get too technical, or stop me if I do, but those models that were developed in 1920s, and that, they're standard for in the epidemiology, but they have almost no biology in them. They've no sociology. They're a mechanistic thing. So they assume that if you were to take it for a generic virus that's new, and you were to do the same thing and you just assumed that it had some fatality and some hospitalization. It doesn't need to be, if it was swine flu 27 or, a new one that'll come. If they rerun the models with this brand new one and they just say it's new, they'll get the same output. The models predict that if, to be technical, if the or not, maybe some of you people remember
we remember all those terms, yeah, the or number. We all became medical experts at the time. Go on.
Oh, yeah. If that is greater than about 1.5, which the modelers were assuming. They still don't know what the R naught for COVID was, by the way. But if it was greater than, they would predict that within a few months, if no interventions were taken, that 80% of the population would get sick within a few months, and at the peak of it, 10 to 20% would be sick and in hospital. And so they were saying, if this happens, this is the end of the world. They said, like, and if it was, then it would be like really terrifying, because
but like the bubonic plague all over again. Yeah.
Well, even if it was, what they were looking at, this is you look at the NEFIT minute meetings, they were looking at this and they were kind of saying, if this happens, we'll have like, the hospitals will be overrun. Imagine 10 to 20% of the population being sick at the one time. So they had all of these things that he said, and the modelers were saying, if you don't want that to happen, you have to throw out all of the pandemic preparedness plans that we already have and come up with completely new things on the hoof. You know, they were just winging it.
Including when you go to a pub, you have to have a €9 meal, which I thought that's going to save you from COVID, because the meal knows you're having a meal.
I just on the €9 meal. Do you remember they had like, it was a 90-minute interval, and then they that protected you for 90 minutes. But then the pub owners were saying, well, what if somebody ordered a pint? We'll add 15 minutes drink up time. So that €9 meal protected you for 105 minutes. What was the virus doing? Was it hovering over 106 minutes?
Waiting for you to finish the meal. Yeah. I mean, the whole thing was quite barmy. And NEFIT, of course, became the government. RTE, of course, became the spokesperson for the government. RTE 61 News was like bingo at night, everybody watching. I'm sure, by the way, if we still did that now, you could still come on RTE News, top story, 10 people have died today. So, I'm sure 10 people have died today. I'm sure 140 people have probably died today or more, whatever. So we could still do that if we really want to, but we're not locking people down anymore, because we know that was a ridiculously stupid mistake. So Gerry, so we needed something, right? They figured we needed some way out of this. And I suppose the golden ticket was the vaccine. This was what was being said from, 6 months in. The vaccine is the only way. That's what we're told is the only way out of this. And then all of a sudden, we had a vaccine. And the way there were people who didn't want to take the vaccine. That's fine. That's their choice. But this whole idea of socially separating society into those who've had the vaccine and those who wouldn't take the vaccine were the social pariahs was horrendous. It was actually awful, what we did to people and what we said to people. And I only put a little survey up on Twitter there the day before yesterday and asked people why they took the vaccine. Only something like 12% of people said they took it for health reasons. The rest felt they were coerced by the state or they wanted to go on holidays. So that's really what happened, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, just to kind of correct one point, I know it's an Irish show and it's an Irish dimension, but these decisions were pretty uniform around the whole world. These policies, especially these vaccine passes, were pretty uniform around the world. And I was sitting outside a restaurant in Dublin, being excluded during that period because they wouldn't let us inside, because I didn't have the vaccine pass and all that. But we could sit outside, the second-class citizens, But it was very tight, but I think they were told to do that, and it wasn't, I don't believe it was.
So when you say they were told to do it, what, by the WHO, EU?
Whoever was directing the Western approach to the COVID pandemic. The group of people who were directing the approach to the COVID pandemic. Because it was pretty uniform. It was almost exact same rules all around, apart from the €9 meal, But the rest of the stuff, But when it came to the vaccine, there was a time when you could only get the new genetic vaccine in Ireland. They wouldn't accept the traditional one. So there was traditional vaccines being from China, and there was some in Russia prepared, but they wouldn't accept those. They'd only accept the new ones.
And what was going on? Because Marcus de Bruin spoke to us and he had a letter from the Irish Medical Council at the time, and I spoke to him on the air at the time in relation to it, which was one of the reasons, by the way, why he ended up having to close his practice. But that traditional methods of medication the doctors were being told by the Irish Medical Council not to prescribe these to people, not to give them to people. This is hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, and anybody who even suggested that these may be useful or they may have some effect or let's just try it out was basically ridiculed as some sort of lunatic.
Yeah, we mentioned this in the paper about the unequal treatment of therapeutics. So the repurposed medicines that had been on the market for 30 or 40 years and were proven to be safe weren't given the same airtime as the new therapy, which was the new genetic vaccine. But they waited 8 months. It was an emergency, but they waited 8 months. And meantime, they told the doctors to do nothing but give anti-inflammatories. So they didn't provide an answer. So this is why some doctors said, well, I'm going to save my patient, and my moral conscience tells me that I want to save my patient. That's what they're trained to do, So, so why? I'm not sure why they introduced the new therapy, the new genetic one, because it's very experimental. I personally don't think they should have released it. I think it's still too experimental. The data that's in, we put some data in our manuscript about the amount of adverse reactions, including death. So why did they move from a traditional technology to this new?
And why do you think they moved from traditional vaccines, which would be a live vaccine, or would have different strains, to an mRNA?
Right, you introduced a manuscript as me and Ronan. There's 37 authors, so we all have.
I see. They're all listed here along the side of it. Yeah, every single one of them.
So I'm just going to preface this by saying this is just my opinion. Okay, the human genome sequence was sequenced around 2000s. Okay, the biotechnology industry was waiting for new products, for new gene products, for health, and they've been waiting a long time. But a lot of these have not materialized. There's really no human genetic therapies. We have them on plants and we have them on other things, but no, not for humans, because they're too experimental. And some of the experiments have been, the results from some of the experiments have not been great. I've had some real disasters. They had a real disaster around 2000, which put a moratorium on it. And a lot of people just kind of abandoned the technology, but there was a lot of investment money. So they've been waiting 20 years for this moment.
And the emergency legislation was an excuse to get it in.
And I think some people thought this is a good time for our new product, But
so you didn't take it, by the way. You didn't
think it wasn't tested enough. Really, really. I mean, the amount of stuff that's unknown about RNA, about regulation of immunity, about bluffing the immunity, about injecting something with an unknown dose for an unknown period of time. There's too many unknowns. Any other medicine would never be passed. So I think they just pushed it and says, well, let's see.
I think,
and that was completely unethical.
Yeah, sorry, Ronan. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out because Gerry alluded to this, and what you said about ivermectin and HCQ is worth mentioning. But there is the other point he was saying is that it wasn't just that there was traditional approaches to medicine, but that the WHO had actually approved by early 2021 when they were doing the rollout, they had approved 5 different COVID-19 vaccines. Or actually 6. So there was the DNA ones, which was the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson, which is a brand new technology, never been tested before. The mRNA, which are still around, which is an even more unique one. So that was Pfizer and Moderna. But they had also approved the Sinovac and Sinopharm, which in the parts of the world is called Coronavac, Coronapharm. That was an inactivated virus vaccine. So that was a conventional approach. it had been past WHO. And in many countries around the world, in the paper, we give a figure. And if you actually look at it, the most common COVID vaccine that was rolled out was actually the Chinese ones, which was not mRNA, not DNA, and that was WHO approved. I had
There was another one called Sputnik as well, isn't there? Wasn't there one called Sputnik?
Yeah, that did,
which I assume was Russian.
Yeah. That didn't get the WHO, and maybe you approval, and maybe there's politics, because I didn't see any difference between that and the AstraZeneca or the. But the point is, I had a number of friends who had taken the WHO approved Chinese vaccine because they were not in the EU at the time, but they couldn't get back into Ireland because unless they took this special mRNA, and so that was not based on WHO. So there was something involved there. And to get back to what Gerry was saying, the idea of these mRNA and DNA vaccines, they would not have been considered a vaccine up till 2021. It's a new approach. Really, this is one of the things you can get fact checked if you actually describe what they actually are. I
agree. By definition, they're not vaccines. By definition.
Yeah, but they've changed the definition so that this is Orwell.
Oh, this is Oxford and Cambridge. So Oxford and Cambridge have rechanged the definition of the word vaccine now to suit the mRNA, yeah?
Yeah. So they were actually changing these definitions specifically to make these now count as being a vaccine. But beforehand, they came out of genetic gene therapy approaches. And in fact, one of our co-authors is Dr. Robert Malone, and he got a number of patents because in the 80s and 90s, he was working on the technology that evolved into mRNA. He took the mRNA vaccines because he was suffering from long COVID, and he said, people were saying, maybe this will help you reduce it. It made things worse for him. And then he started speaking out. And then they called him an anti-vaxxer because...
That's right, yeah. And he's the man who actually he was one of the people who developed the technology, and then they went on to call him an anti-vaxxer, which was quite bizarre.
Yeah.
And the same went for the guy that developed the PCR tests, who said it should.
Mullins.
Yeah, he was sadly passed away as well. He said it shouldn't have been used for this purpose, that it was never designed to be used for the purpose, because that was another thing we did during COVID-19. This demand constantly to get tested, even though you were perfectly fit as a fiddle. I went into work one day, and our boss had got a load of antigen tests, and he said, "Oh, go on, everyone is there, just use one of these." So there was only about 10 of us in, because the rest of them were all on remote work. And because I was doing the talk show, obviously it was more technically difficult to do at home. So we all tested ourselves, and I tested positive. So I was sent home, and I said, "Andy, I'm perfectly fine." I said, "There's nothing wrong with me." He said, "Oh no, you have to go home. You can't be in the building." He says, "Be the insurance and other people complain." So that was grand. So I went home, and he'd ring me then every day or two, and he'd go, "How are you feeling?" I said, "I'm fine. There's nothing wrong with me. Can I come back to work, please?" And he went, "Yeah, just wait till the 5 days or whatever." There was a 5 or 7 days that I had to wait. There was actually nothing wrong with me at all. I was perfectly fine. The antigen test said I had COVID-19, but the same with the PCR tests. These were so amplified that if you even pass somebody or sniff somebody with the virus, you might show up as having, some sort of viral load or something like that. I don't know. I mean, it was all about numbers, wasn't it?
The mistake with the PCR test is they just gave a positive or negative result. They said positive, but it might be because the usual cycle to find something is like 21 cycles. Each cycle it doubles the number.
They were on 35, wasn't it, or something?
No, they went away 40 and even 45.
And who was responsible for that? Killian Degaskin at the time. He was the man, wasn't he, responsible for deciding how that was operated?
Can I just start, because we had some discussions with one of our colleagues, with Killian Degaskin, and then we also said, we discussed it in the paper. There is a lot of a compartmentalization. An analogy I did was each of the people in NEFIT or in the advisory groups, wherever they were, they would have one specialty. And it's like they would give them 5 jigsaw pieces and they say, you solve these bitch, and you solve these. And they would give each of the people 10 or jigsaw pieces, and they're supposed to assemble this 1,000-piece jigsaw. And it's like, they could maybe get 2 or 3 pieces together, but there was no cohesion between them. So if you had, like, say on these cycle thresholds, there was a rationale for doing super high cycle thresholds, because with COVID, one of the unique things about it is that the infectious period just comes very, very rapidly. Like, I caught COVID twice, and in each cases, it's like the people I caught it off, only they were just getting sick. And then it isn't enough that they were fine. So when you use the cycle threshold, if you increase it, you can detect very early on, but you will also detect somebody that's very, very weak or is asymptomatic. And so one of our colleagues we started working with from the very beginning. He was totally shocked because mid-2020, they changed what's called the case definition. What is a case definition? They dropped the requirement for symptoms, and they switched to just being a test, a positive result. Now, this is highly unusual. This is like, he was saying that he was working at always, you have laboratory tests can be an optional. You might include it. We think it might be this, but maybe we'll do a test just to confirm. But the main thing for most cases is, what are the symptoms? Do they have headache? Do they have fever, etc.? And then maybe have they come back with a PCR test for this? They flipped it on its head in mid-2020. So it didn't matter whether
it was just a test. The test said it. Yeah, I know, but that's what I used to say at the time. It's the only disease you have to be told that you have. You know?
Yeah, exactly. So this thing about the cycle thresholds, which, what Carrie Mullis was saying, particularly about HIV, is he's saying there's a difference between being HIV positive and actually having the AIDS. And it's like, you may have tested positive for the thing, but that didn't mean that you had the illness or the sickness. So if they had actually said, instead of every day on the news, they said, we have this number of new cases. If they'd said, we have this number of SARS-CoV-2 positive, and we have this number of COVID cases, then people would be that could have been it
would have been a more accurate picture. Absolutely.
Yeah. It would have led to some discussion.
Okay, it's okay. So here, that's the next thing I want to get to and ask you. By the way, did both of you, did either one of you get the COVID injection, the vaccine?
No, not me. But like,
not you, Gerry. No,
quite a few of our co-authors did.
I was contemplating it. I think was I contemplating it? No, Ronan asked me to look at the sequence of the vaccine and see where it came from, and then I understood it was gene technology, and then they had dabbled with the bases and added these pseudouridines, and I read a bit more about it, and I was like, no, that's not, definitely not. It's a reprogramming. I don't want any of it, So. It's
funny that the amount of doctors I've spoken to over the last 3 or 4 years have told me they didn't take the vaccine. And yet the rest of us, there's plebs.
I mean, I went right up until the hepatitis B.
But I mean, I'm pro-vaccine. I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to come across as anti-vax, because I'm very pro-vaccine. Even on the radio, I have the HPV vaccine, the childhood immunizations programs. I'm all for them. But when it came to COVID-19 vaccine, like everybody else, I had my doubts. But you know why I got it? Because at that stage, I would have let them stick it in my eyeball because I wanted to go to America on holidays. And that was the only reason I took the vaccine, so I could get a passport so I could leave the bloody country.
Yeah.
Well, and by the way, that was in November before we finished our things, right? So we were still in the middle of the height of lockdowns and masks and everything. And I went over to Florida, and it was like nothing was happening. It was like there was nothing going on. What virus? What are you talking about? There was nothing going on over there.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
There was a famous incident in 2000 in America. with a guy called Jesse. I can't remember the second name, but he had a huge reaction to genetic technology. And at the time, I was a student and I was wanting to earn some extra money. But as soon as that news came out, I was like, it was a horrific death. And I was like, there's no way. Because he was just signing up for a medical experiment, like me, earn more money. And then I was like, there's no way I'm touching anything. So I didn't really know the difference between the vaccines. I thought that I could get a regular one. And then when I read that the regular ones weren't available, you had to, this genetic one or nothing, then no, I wasn't.
Well, the problem for me is now, I don't know, and I certainly can't say it was the vaccine that did it, but I'm seeing numerous different doctors and specialists at the moment because I've been unwell for the last 9 months. I've been in hospital for nearly a month. They've no idea what's really wrong with me, apart from the fact that I have an immune disorder. I got mononukleosis and I got Lyme disease, but I have an immune disorder now.
So something related to the Epstein-Barr virus or something?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So thankfully, I'm kind of in recovery.
A side effect of vaccines, and it's quite a regular one as well.
Yeah, so that's, but I've had it since January, which is just bizarre. I have an enlarged spleen, enlarged liver, a vagus nerve that has a mind of its own. So,
are they giving you any treatment? Or?
No, but I'm going to see another specialist in about 2 weeks. And I've spoken to him already, and he's been talking to me about different treatments that he's been giving people. And I know Jack Lambert in the Mater Hospital has been treating a lot of people as well. Professor Jack Lambert, who was on with us during COVID-19 as well on many occasions, has been treating people as well for, long-term, either long COVID or maybe problems, coming from the vaccine as well. So there's no doubt that this vaccine, compared to others, mainly due to the fact that we gave it to more people than ever before. But in saying that, apart from anything else, the fact that it was a new vaccine, it was an mRNA vaccine, we didn't really understand the complications that maybe it would have had in the future. There's no doubt that it has a disproportionate amount of adverse reactions.
Yes, for sure.
Is that a fair statement?
You just have to look at the VAERS database over in America to see the amount of deaths and adverse reactions. The graph just now shows that the most reports on VAERS, like more than half of them, are from this one technology. And I don't know when they've been reported, since 1980.
But the government are never, but Gerry, the government are never going to get into this conversation we're having. Like, you're not going to get Simon Harris, Micheál Martin at the table.
One of the reasons we wrote this manuscript is because now there is an attempt to rewrite the history. I mean, everybody knows it's documented through radio programs, media, TV of what happened. But maybe not scientifically. And we have written this so that, we can give our point of view or our side of the story as to what happened. We include like 5 or 10 references after each statement from people that disagree with us, but also from people that agree with us, to give the scientific perspective. But, nothing can move forward if there's anything similar situation again, if we don't acknowledge that mistakes were made. And the government have to admit there was some mistakes made.
But they won't. They don't even want but they don't even want the inquiry. The inquiry, they've been threatening this inquiry now for 2.5 years. And the last I heard of it was Leo Varadkar talking about it, about when he was in politics, going back about 6 months ago or 8 months ago, whenever it was. And he said, we'll definitely do that. They certainly weren't going to do it before an election, that's for sure. And even when they do it, they don't want it to turn into a blame game. So nobody's going to be accountable.
Nah. If they can get away with it, if they can get away with it, they'll get away with it. But somebody needs to be held to account. You can't. We're talking about deaths here. We're not talking about like an intellectual discussion of who done what. People died because of mistakes were made.
Okay, but would you say, Ronan, that the lockdowns, the restrictions, and our change of life, our lifestyle changes, because there was a paper come out in Pittsburgh, I think, that talked about the amount of incalculable deaths that could happen because of lifestyle change. Suddenly, during lockdowns, people drink more, they eat more, they change their habits, they don't walk as much, they don't get as much exercise, they don't get to see a doctor if they got that twinge in their left breast, for example, or a lump or something, so they don't get it examined, cervical cancer screening, all of that was abandoned literally for 2 years. Do you think there is going to be more deaths long term from the lockdowns and the restrictions than there was from actually COVID-19?
in many countries around the world, there is what's called the excess mortality. So what you're doing is you look at the average number of deaths in each year, because there's, as you mentioned it earlier on, every year people die. We all ultimately die. That's every one of us, and so we die at some point. So every year people die. And then if you can look at, you obviously have to correct for population growth. But when people have looked at that, there's been a number of groups that have been seeing worrying increases in excess mortality relative to pre-COVID. And the difficulty is that we can see a lot of the excess mortality is occurring in 2021, 2022, 2023, which are the years when the vaccines are in place. And as I know, I could just say personally, because this is anecdotes. And so as a scientist, I'm not supposed to look at anecdotes, but at some point, when you have enough anecdotes, it kind of becomes data, because I personally know a lot of people and colleagues and friends that passed away, and many of them, like some of them passed away before the vaccine rollouts, but most of them passed away after the vaccine rollouts or developed severe or new medical complaints. It's like you have a question about, like, oh, could the medical complaint that you now have, might it be related? Well, that's a question you're not allowed to ask. And there's a lot of people that I know that have questions about that, and that they're not allowed to ask, or if they mention it to their doctor, say,
I mentioned it to a consultant in the hospital, and he looked at me like a 10 heads. I think he thought I was some sort of conspiracy theorist. I only asked the question. I said, could it be related to the fact that the vaccine? And he went, no, not. And he kind of brushed me off. But anyway, look, I know what I have, but why I ended up getting it, because I'm a 62 in September. But all my life I've been very healthy. I've never been in hospital in my life. I've never had an illness in my life, touch wood, thank God, up to this point. And now I'm extremely ill. Thankfully, I'm getting better now. But in saying that, I'm going to need some help. But I am going to talk to other specialists now, which may be slightly unconventional, because that's what you kind of have to do. But here's the thing. A lot of people are going to say, well, why didn't all these doctors, professors, scientists, data experts, why didn't you all come out, towards the end of COVID-19 or during COVID-19? Why now? When the horse is already bolted, people have died, people could have been advised against taking the vaccine if genuinely a lot of people thought it wasn't such a great idea. Why now? Was it a fear, Gerry, of losing your job? Because people did lose their jobs. Good doctors lost their jobs. Martin Feely is probably the best example.
I'm sure there's many molecular biologists and other scientists that understood what was happening, virologists, and they knew exactly the detail of what was happening and why a lot of it didn't add up, and why we didn't speak out. Well, the answer is we did. We tried. This paper is a culmination of 3 other papers that we wrote previously.
Yeah, there's a lot of work in that paper, can I just say?
This paper took 3 years to come to the publication. The Drosten paper, which was on the PCR test in Germany, that there was the official PCR test, took 2 days to be reviewed and published. 2 days. Our paper took 3 years to be reviewed and published. So a lot of those authors on there also know that if they don't say the official narrative, if they don't talk about, if they don't agree with what was happening, it took a long time. And so what happened and we discussed this at the end of our papers, there was professional institutes set up in several countries to tarnish scientists, to delay publication, and to basically ridicule them. And also some of them had their reported to the universities, they had their livelihood removed, and then they became independent scientists, like some of the authors on this paper.
That's incredible. So in other words, we've learned absolutely nothing. But I think we are at a turning point. I think people are starting to question it, particularly people who maybe feel ill after taking the vaccine. And I think people who look back at how we treated people during that particular time period. I always remember that famous picture of somebody standing outside a nursing home looking through the glass at their mother dying. And those kind of things, the way it was absolutely ridiculous, the way we treated people during COVID-19, the way people were pitted against each other for those who took the vaccine and those who didn't take the vaccine. It turns out really it didn't make a huge amount of difference. I never actually tested the vaccine for transmissibility either, which was a lie that people were told. We were all lied to by governments, and yet governments and NEFIT don't want to be accountable for what they did and what they said and things they said that they knew weren't actually true at the time. Some of the things that went wrong, they can claim they did it in the best interest of the people, but there wasn't clarity around the scientific evidence at the time, so they did it with caution, and understandable. But a lot of the things were completely unnecessary. And you say what lessons can be learned, which is the title of the paper, what lessons can be learned for the management of COVID-19 pandemic. I don't think we've learned any lessons, lads. Just finally, I suppose, Ronan, do you think if we had another pandemic, COVID-20, in 2 years' time, things would be any different? Or do you think it'd be worse because most countries have now signed up to the WHO treaty?
Yeah, at the end of the paper, we addressed this discussion on why did we not hear different views, and we give a nice quote, which he says, "I would rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned," and that is the biggest problem. Like, you can get into the technical details about the SEER model, about the PCR, the cycle thresholds, ivermectin. You could get into all of this stuff. The biggest problem was, and there's many facets. We look at the role of the media. We look at the role of the public. As you said, the curtain twitching. We look at the role of the governments. We look at the role of the fact checkers. We look at ultimately the Facebook. We mentioned social media platforms. Ultimately, all of these things come down to the problem. The one problem: we were not allowed to question the answers that cannot be questioned. And that society, through all of these mechanisms, they shifted towards allowing this. Like, you were one of, I had friends who, and family that listened to your station. They had their station on the radio station tuned to you during 2020 they couldn't listen to RTE or any of the things because you were one of the only ones that was actually asking questions. And here's the thing. It's not that you were crazy for asking questions, because if the answers are robust, the answers that we're told to memorize, and, and forget that 3 weeks ago, it was a different answer, and you're supposed to forget that. The answers changed jumped. The jockey was jumping mid-race, and everything there. It's because if you ask a question, then you can actually come up with a more solid answer, a more robust answer. We were not allowed to ask questions. So what Gerry was saying about the censorship of what we were doing, there was the things anybody who was speaking out, I found on Facebook, I would be trying to gently nudge people and then not so gently nudge people throughout 2020, 21. And then I was being shadow banned because I was...
I got that too, yeah. I got that too on Twitter. Yeah, I was shadow banned on Twitter. So
yeah. To get back to your question, will it be different? The only way it will be any different is if the next time people actually allowed people of different perspectives, and it's not just scientists, but do allow scientists of different perspectives. But if everything, there is a John Stuart Mill, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he wrote in this book in 1869 against liberty, or, he wrote on liberty. He said, if you only know one side of the case, you know little of that. And that's the problem. Even if the science trademark that the governments and the media said, here is your latest, the science you must memorize, even if it were true, science doesn't work by memorizing lists. Science is Gerry and I, our co-authors, we are continually disagreeing with each other on many different aspects. And that's how science works, because science only progresses when we are disagreeing with it. If we all agree, then we're not doing science.
When we don't question, we're seeing that again, of course, with climate change. And don't get me wrong, I'm not a climate denier by any stretch of the imagination, because it's fierce warm today. Anyway, but in saying that, the idea that one particular journalist, who's quite famous for the money he's probably making from climate change, suggested to RTE that anybody that had a different viewpoint around climate change and the idea that human beings may be responsible for it shouldn't be allowed on radio and shouldn't have a platform. And that's exactly what we did during COVID-19. That's what we're doing now during climate change, for climate change policy. That's what we're doing constantly all the time. So it just seemed that the government pick a narrative and then the state broadcaster will run with the government's narrative because they're being paid $750 million from the state's money. So they have to go along with that narrative. That's what seems to be happening. And most people in the media, which surprises me from some of my colleagues, particularly during COVID-19, one in particular, who I looked up to for many years, by the way, a very mature broadcaster, basically were calling people out and calling people murderers and all sorts of things for not taking the vaccine. But anyway, look, we could go on about this. This could be a 10-hour interview. The paper is amazing. I had a scan to it. I'm not going to tell you that I read the whole thing because I'd be lying. But if I had a chance, I am going to read the whole thing. But I went through it and I was looking at some of the interesting points in it. A lot of the points which I've raised in the past myself as well. But you've gone into them in great detail. And there's a lot of evidence there. All the sources are there in the paper as well. It's an incredible paper. We'll put a link to that as well when we put the podcast up as well if people want to see the paper, if that's okay with you guys. But I do thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. I think it's a bit of an eye-opener for people. And well done. Thank you very much indeed, lads. Dr. Gerry Quinn and Dr. Ronan Connolly, thank you for coming on today and explaining why we weren't so prepared and how we should be prepared in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Niall.
The multi-award-winning Niall Boylan Podcast. Listen live on Facebook, YouTube, and all the usual live stream services. To get in touch, just WhatsApp or text 085 100 2255. The Niall Boylan Podcast. They told me to shut up. Available for download from all your usual platforms.